Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I hadn't seen my parents in almost 3 years, and if life had been remotely fair, I would have gone another 30 without crossing that threshold again. But life rarely grants clean exits, especially when it comes to families who specialize in pretending. The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope. Robert and Diane Carter invite you to celebrate 40 years of love and commitment. It sounded like a headline from a lifestyle magazine, tasteful, proud, entirely detached from reality. I held it in my hand for a long time before deciding to go. Not because I forgave them, and not because I missed them, but because I wanted to see the people who could look me in the eye and still sleep at night after letting my son die. The event was at a banquet hall in downtown Louisville, the kind of place that smells faintly of roses, polished wood, and money. I arrived late enough that everyone was already seated, my heels clicking across the marble floor, drawing curious glances. My sister Emily was at the front table in a pastel dress, laughing too loudly beside her husband, whose tie screamed insecurity. My parents sat beside them, glowing under the lights, surrounded by friends from church and Dad's old golf buddies. It was a picture of success, devotion, and family values, a tableau I had once been a part of before I became the inconvenient reminder of their failures. As I walked toward the back, conversations dimmed just slightly, like a curtain lowering half an inch. A few relatives smiled at me out of reflex, the kind of smiles people give when they aren't sure if they should acknowledge the ghost in the room. I found an empty seat at a side table near the floral arch, where the air smelled too sweet. The waiter asked if I wanted wine. I nodded. Red, something strong enough to steady my hands. When my mother spotted me, her expression froze for a heartbeat before snapping back into the rehearsed graciousness of a hostess. Melissa. Oh, darling, you made it, she said, her tone bright but sharp-edged, as if I were a tax audit that had unexpectedly shown up at her door. My father gave a small nod from his seat, the kind that meant nothing and everything at once. Emily turned around, blinking as though she had seen an apparition, and whispered something to her husband, who glanced at me, then at my parents, then down at his plate. They went on with their speeches, 40 years of marriage, God's blessings, family unity, the usual varnish. My mother dabbed her eyes when the slideshow started, photos of their wedding day, their first house, Emily's graduation, her wedding, her 3 children grinning like a catalog family. My face appeared in 2 photos total, one from high school, another from the last Christmas before Ethan was diagnosed. They had cropped out the oxygen tank behind him. I felt something inside me twist, not quite pain, not quite anger, more like recognition of an old wound that never closed because someone kept picking at it. When the applause died down and dessert was served, I stood. My heart was steady. I hadn't come here to beg, not again. I had come to return something, to lay it down right where everyone could see it. I raised my glass and said, a toast. The chatter faded quickly. Forks froze midair. Even the kids seemed to sense the change in the air. To family, I said, smiling faintly. To the kind of love that endures through sickness and health, through truth and lies, through everything you do for the people you say you care about. My mother laughed nervously, thinking I was making a joke. Oh, Melissa, you always had such a dramatic way with words, she said, and the laughter around the room came like a nervous echo. But my voice didn't shake when I continued. I'm glad you all could gather tonight, I said. It's been a long time since I've seen so many of you in one place. You look wonderful. Happy. Whole. I paused, watching their faces, the way guilt ripples in small, involuntary ways, tightened jaws, lowered eyes, the twitch of someone's hand gripping a napkin too hard. I wanted to say thank you, I went on, for being there for my parents all these years, for supporting them, for standing beside them when things got difficult. My father shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. You know, I used to think money was a measure of love. I used to think when you're in trouble, family comes through for you. That's what I believed until I found out love has balance sheets too. The air felt electric, charged with unease. I saw my sister's husband glance at Emily again, his face paling. My mother reached for her water glass. My father's hand clenched on his knee, the muscle twitching just once. I could have ended it there. But I didn't. You all know my son Ethan, I said quietly. At least, I hope you remember him. He was 8 when he died. Leukemia. The doctors said the treatment could have saved him if we started early enough. My words were steady, factual, the way doctors read charts after the patient is gone. I remember sitting in that hospital room, praying, bargaining, doing math on scraps of paper, calling people, asking for help. I remember calling my parents. The silence deepened. A chair creaked somewhere in the back. I smiled again, small, almost gentle. They told me they couldn't help. That times were tough. That they just didn't have the money. So I thanked them and hung up. I set my glass down slowly, the sound of it on the table sharp in the quiet. Funny thing though, sometimes life gives you strange math. The kind that adds up years later, when you least expect it. My mother's face drained of color. My father cleared his throat. "Melissa," he began, his voice careful, warning, but I lifted a hand. "No worries," I said lightly. "We'll save the rest for dessert." I smiled, picked up my glass again, and raised it once more. "To family," I repeated, softer this time. "May we always get what we deserve." I drank, and the room stayed perfectly still, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks open. No one clapped. No one spoke. My mother stared at me as if she finally saw something she had tried for years not to recognize. I sat back down, heart still steady, the taste of wine lingering on my tongue like the beginning of a reckoning that was only getting started. The night the oncologist explained the protocol in slow, careful sentences that made time kink like a bent straw, I sat with a legal pad and drew boxes beside every phrase as if I could check my way out of the worst thing that ever happened to me. And when he left the room to let me cry in private, I did not cry. I calculated, adding up the copay and the out-of-network consult and the experimental infusion the insurer would almost certainly deny. And then I circled the total and wrote the word "find" under it because there is a point in every mother's life when the universe stops being poetic and turns into arithmetic, and the only language that matters is whether the math keeps your child breathing for one more day. The pediatric floor had that dry, over-clean smell that slides under your skin, and after lights out the monitors seemed to exhale more loudly, and I learned to read their rhythms the way you learn a person's breathing when you love them so hard you start listening with your bones, and I told myself that if I stayed very calm and kept calling people and kept asking nicely, someone would step forward and help fill the space between what the hospital required and what my bank account could carry without collapsing. I swallowed my pride so many times it turned into something I could drink like bad coffee, and I set up an online fundraiser with photos that made me feel like a beggar parading my child through a marketplace. And I called my boss and filed for leave, and I sold the dented sedan that had been my freedom, and every day I thought, we are still in this, we are still in the ring, we are still contenders. When I finally dialed my parents, I rehearsed the speech twice, shaving off every trace of accusation so it sounded like logistics, and when my mother picked up she was brisk and warm in that way she reserves for charity committees and funeral potlucks. And I laid out the numbers and the schedule and the gap, and I said I would pay them back in installments even if it took me the rest of my life, because what is a life for if not to be traded for the person you brought into it? She asked me to hold while she looped in my father, corporate language that made the linoleum beneath my shoes feel colder, and then he was there with his professional voice, the one that says we will take this offline. And he told me they were in a tight spot with the market and the roof and the church pledge, and that they had already given so much this year, and that they loved us very much and would pray without ceasing, which is a sentence that can sound like a hug and a dismissal at the same time. I thanked them because fury would have cost me seconds, and seconds were oxygen, and after I hung up I went back to the spreadsheet and moved numbers around like furniture, leaving grooves where the generosity should have been. And then I climbed into the narrow hospital bed with my son, and we watched a science video about planets, because he liked the one with rings that look like a hula hoop, and I promised him we would go to the Natural History Museum when the snow melted. A promise I made with the clean confidence of someone who refuses to check the weather. Weeks became a braided rope of ward corridors, appeals letters, and the heavy quiet you get after a nurse leaves, and you know you are the only adult in the room who can change anything. And then there was the morning the resident spoke to me in that soft, Winterfield tone doctors learn for moments when language must be padded, and she told me the window for the best outcome had narrowed past safe, and I signed a form with a pen that did not work the first time, and I pressed too hard and left a trench in the paper, and for a second I hated that pen with a clarity that felt like sanity returning just to remind me it could. At the funeral I wore a dress that did not fit right because my body had turned into a storage unit for grief, and my parents looked handsome in their black. And people said the correct words to me and placed envelopes in my hand as if I were a bank teller collecting deposits of sorrow, and I smiled the way you smile when your face belongs to the public for a day and you need the public to go home thinking you will be all right. 3 days later, when the flowers had begun to smell like something that wanted to be thrown away but was still clinging to its best self, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. And on the screen her cheerful sentences jogged toward me like a neighbor waving from across a lawn, and she wrote that she and her husband had found a house near a better school and that mom and dad were going to help with the down payment because they said family should invest in family, and she added a string of hearts that I could feel even with the colors turned off, and I stared at it long enough that the screen dimmed and my face looked back at me like a stranger's. I could have answered with the things I was thinking, but there is a special kind of elegance to restraint when everyone expects you to bleed in public, so I did something that looked like nothing and felt like a match being struck. I opened the church prayer chain email thread my mother adored, the long list of earnest names that met casseroles with casseroles, and I typed a short, gracious thank you to the congregation for covering the gap when my parents could not, and I attached a simple one-page ledger from the fundraiser showing dates and shortfalls without comment. And I hit send with the same stillness I used to hold my son's hand when his veins ached, and then I put my phone face down and listened to the house breathe. I did not need to watch the replies arrive. I knew the gossip would sprout where sunlight could not, I knew the story would wander without my tending, and I knew that for once the arithmetic might add up on its own. Because in towns like ours the only thing stronger than money is the question of where it went. I went back to their house on a gray afternoon that smelled like wet cardboard and old flowers, carrying a shoebox of photos I pretended belonged to them and not to the life I was trying to keep from molding, and I rang the bell the way a visitor does. 2 patient chimes and a practiced smile that says I can be civilized even when the floorboards remember my childhood footsteps better than they remember my name. My mother opened the door with a hostess face so polished it reflected the street. She exclaimed over the box, as if photographs were puppies that needed petting. And she ushered me past the entry table with its engraved invitation stacks and the framed needlepoint about faith and family, and when I said I could put the box upstairs, she nodded too quickly, eager to avoid being alone with me in a room that did not have witnesses, and she floated back toward the kitchen while I climbed toward the place where the house keeps its most honest air. In the hall closet, I reached behind winter coats and found the attic cord, and a small snowfall of dry insulation dusted the shoulders of my jacket as the ladder unfolded, and I thought, if ghosts come anywhere, they come here. To the boxes no one opens because truth hates direct light but loves corners. The attic greeted me with the condensed breath of a lifetime, those shallow plastic tubs labeled in my mother's tidy script, holidays and seasons, and a bin devoted to Emily's school awards, and then another for Emily's children. As if history deserved separate containers, depending on its likelihood of being shown to guests. I put the shoebox on a trunk that once held quilts and now held nothing, and I followed the instinct that all scavengers learn, which is to search where a person would hide what they need close enough to touch and far enough to deny. And behind a crate of ceramic angels wrapped in newspaper I found a thin file box, the kind accountants buy when they do not want to look dramatic, secured with a rubber band that had given up on elasticity, but still believed in appearances. Inside were folders with month names and a tidy stack of carbon copies and printouts, transfers to Emily and her husband's joint account marked for insurance premiums and mortgage supplements, and a spring break trip described only as family reset, and checks to a private school that my parents had toured once and declared too pretentious when I asked about scholarships for Ethan. and on a yellow sticky note in my mother's handwriting a reminder to increase the monthly cushion, while Melissa is in the hospital, so she does not feel tempted to ask again. A sentence so careful it had ironed out its own cruelty until it lay flat and deliciously legible. I did not cry, which surprised me less than it might have, because rage can dehydrate tears until all that remains is a bright, mineral clarity, and I took photographs with the softness of a burglar who cares about the furniture. Aligning dates with the calendar in my head, matching each deposit to a week, I remember eating saltines for dinner in a chair that reclined harder than I did, mapping the steady river of help that had flowed past us while I stood in a drought and tried to pretend the mirage tasted like water. There was a ledger, of course there was, a clean grid of outgoing support categorized as family investment, and in the margin a small flourish my father uses when something pleases him. And I traced the loop with one finger, because sometimes your body wants proof it can still feel where the nerve has been cauterized. I packaged my evidence with the patience of someone who has learned that speed is the luxury of people who have nothing to lose, and I slipped a single sheet, the most boring one, the monthly memorandum summarizing totals and upcoming commitments, into a manila envelope with a return address from the church's benevolence committee, which I kept folded in my wallet like an ancient amulet because it reminded me of the precise shape of their public virtue, and I sealed another set of copies in an email to myself and to a private archive that would send duplicates whether or not I ever clicked again, and I put the file box exactly where I found it, rubber band and all, because I did not need theatrics when arithmetic could hum its own suspense. On my way downstairs, I paused in the guest room where a book of inspirational recipes lay open to a casserole that had fed me after the funeral, and I slid a photocopy into its plastic sleeve so that whoever reached for comfort next would have to turn the page past a neat column of numbers that cooked a different kind of nourishment. And then I carried the shoebox to the kitchen where my mother was arranging cheese into symmetrical rows, and I set the box on the island and thanked her for letting me return what belonged at home, a phrase that made her eyes soften because it sounded like surrender even as it tasted like salt. She asked if I would stay for coffee, and I told her I would take it to go because I had errands, which was true if you count walking across a parking lot and breathing as errands, and I stepped out into a daylight that had thinned to the color of old pearls. At the church office, I slipped the manila envelope through the mail slot for the benevolence committee with the kind of quiet joy that does not look like joy at all, and I walked back to my car with my hands empty and my pockets light, and I laughed once, not a pretty sound. More like a hinge remembering it was built to move, because small revenge does not announce itself with fanfare, it turns a key where people feel safest and lets the wind in, and by the time anyone notices the draft, the papers have already shifted on the desk and the dust has written the first letter of a story no one wanted told. Grief did not leave me like a storm that passes and gives the neighborhood a rainbow. It settled like a long winter that demands new habits, so I learned the practical rituals of survival with the stubborn commitment of someone who has never been good at quitting. And I built my days from slow, deliberate tasks that reshaped the house without pretending to cure it, repainting the hallway that still held Ethan's height marks, sorting the medical papers into a sealed box labeled with a date I promised myself not to open, and teaching my hands to cook again because grief had taught them to lift only takeout lids and paper cups, and in the quiet hours I found a counselor who did not use platitudes like throw pillows, she used questions like wrenches. And with her I faced the blunt, undressed fact that I had started to hate my own face for surviving the person whose face I loved, and that if I did not forgive my skin for staying here I would end up building a shrine instead of a life. I took a job at the hospice because I trusted people who speak softly near thresholds, and there I learned the precise temperature of a room where a child is finally comfortable. And I learned that love looks like clipping a parent's hospital bracelet off their wrist because the edges had begun to scratch, and I learned to breathe through other people's stories without stealing them, which is a discipline they should teach in schools right after algebra. Money arrived slowly. A few back pay settlements and a state grant I had applied for while half asleep, and with it came a small, loyal relief that sat on my shoulder and told me I did not have to rush revenge like a cheap meal. I could choose a tablecloth and wait until the kitchen got it right, and in that waiting I discovered something both embarrassing and liberating, which is that anger ages better when you store it in quiet dignity than when you wave it around like a parade baton. So I made lists not of enemies but of outcomes, and the top line kept reading the same way: tell the truth once, in a place where lies are the decor, and then walk away before the echo tries to hire you. I drafted sentences the way carpenters draft measurements, careful to leave no wiggle room for noblesse oblige responses about misunderstandings, concerns, and generational differences. And I practiced saying Ethan's name without apology and without theatrics, and when I could do that without my voice curdling, I allowed myself to imagine the room I would say it in, with tablecloths white enough to make guilt squint and centerpieces designed to hide conversations. The room where my parents would be flattered into bravery and then reminded what bravery costs when you outsource it to other people's children. The envelope to the Benevolence Committee did its work without requiring my supervision, because churches are like well-watered lawns that betray their secrets whenever you walk across them. And within 2 weeks my mother called in that voice she uses when she needs to sound like a person who knows a different truth than the one available to the public, and she asked if we could meet to clear the air. Which amused me because the air was clear for the first time in years, and I told her I was busy but grateful for the invitation, which was both honest and a little mean, and then I turned my face toward the calendar and waited for the inevitable golden ticket, the anniversary dinner, embossed and pious. That would bring everyone who had practiced their ignorance into one room where the sound system could help me carry the weight. In the meantime, I began a series of small, ungenerous renovations to the narrative they had written about me. I sent a thank you note to the school Emily's children attended, a simple, sunny paragraph expressing gratitude to the anonymous grandparents who value education across branches of the family tree, which any tired administrator would read as harmless and any busybody would copy to 3 friends, and I dropped a folded photocopy of the monthly family investment summary into the pocket of Dad's suit jacket during a brief visit for a paperwork signature he had requested, knowing he would discover it at the least convenient moment, and although these gestures were not strictly necessary, they tasted like ice water after a long run, which is to say they reminded me my body still belonged to me and could choose pleasure that did not apologize for existing. On the morning of the event, I woke early, not because of nerves, but because my body had trained itself to honor moments that carried risk, and instead of rehearsing, I ironed a dress that fit the person I had rebuilt. Nothing dramatic. Just an ordinary elegance that signaled I knew how to carry my own weight, and I placed into my purse a slim folder that held the 1-page summary and 3 photographs of checks that would not require anyone to squint, and I added, because I am still my mother's daughter in certain unflattering ways, a neat stack of small thank you cards, blank inside, as if I might hand them out afterward to anyone who managed to look me in the eye, a joke so dry I laughed alone in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. I drove without music, which felt like discipline but also like a favor to the thought that kept crossing the road in front of me, that thought being, this is not a trial, this is not a war, this is a house inspection where the lights must be turned on in every room and the inspector must remain calm even when the basement smells like the truth. When I parked across from the banquet hall, I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel and told the ghost of my son that I would keep his name safe even in a room where people prefer initials. And then I stepped out into the afternoon heat and walked through doors that opened with the soft arrogance of places that have never learned shame, and as the hostess pinned a ribbon to my dress that said family, I felt the smallest tremor of something that was not fear at all. It was steadiness, clearing its throat. My phone vibrated in my purse with 2 new messages I did not check, because I did not need instructions or encouragement anymore. I needed only the microphone, the glass, and the courage to do what I had promised myself when I first read the ledger's clean columns, and so I crossed the carpet toward the tables dressed like a polite battlefield, already tasting the quiet that would follow the first sentence I spoke. I had promised myself I would not perform grief like a talent show, and I would not let anger turn me into a tabloid headline. So when the band finished its faithful version of an old love song and the MC invited us to honor the couple with a few words, I stood in a dress that fit like a decision and walked toward the microphone as if I had merely remembered something ordinary, and I asked for a glass of water because the small choreography of need relaxes a room, and when the noise had lowered into that attentive murmur people give to prayer or scandal, I said that family, at its best, is a long loan with forgiving terms, and at its worst it is a ledger that pretends to be a hug, and the room exhaled in a single, confused breath that told me I had found the precise middle of their comfort and pierced it. I spoke my son's name the way I had practiced in the mirror until it sounded like truth and not an accusation, and I described the hospital nights without ornament, not the gore and not the poetry, just the arithmetic of survival and the way numbers march you to the door of a possibility and tell you to knock. And I told them I knocked until my knuckles went dumb, and I told them I called home. And I told them home said there was nothing left to give but thoughts and prayers, which, for the record, weigh nothing on a scale that measures infusion bags and hours. I let the silence stand, because silence is not empty, it is a pressure system, and then I reached into my purse and removed the slim folder that I had opened and closed so many times the crease had learned my fingerprints. And I slid onto the white linen the single page that could have been a grocery list for how ordinary it looked, and I said that I was grateful to learn, much later, in an attic that smelled like the past, that generosity had not left our family at all. It had only been routed with intention and discretion toward a branch of the tree that was already well watered, and I placed, beside the summary, the 3 glossy photographs of checks arranged like postcards from a vacation I had not been invited to. And I did not raise my voice and I did not point, because arithmetic does not require volume to be believed. My mother made a small sound like a piano bench sliding, and my father's jaw moved once, as if he had bitten into a pit he did not expect, and Emily whispered a no. That contained neither denial nor apology, only the childish wish that the sheet of paper would fold itself back into the envelope and go to sleep. I told the room, which included the church committee chair who had already held the manila envelope I mailed and the golf buddy who enjoys advising others on stewardship, that I had not come for their outrage or their pity. And I had not come to harvest apologies like candy from a parade, and I had not come to set fire to a house that I had already left standing behind me, because I had learned in hospice that the loudest thing you can do sometimes is to sit down. And that is exactly what I did. Leaving the documents on the table where dessert had been promised, and in that ridiculous stillness a cousin coughed, a child asked his mother if the party was over, and the band leader adjusted his tie as if strangled by his own good manners. The MC fumbled for a joke and abandoned it mid-flight. My father reached for the papers and knocked his water glass into his lap. My mother dabbed nothing with a napkin as if she could erase ink by polishing the air, and Emily stood too quickly, the chair legs scraping the floor like a cry, and she said that I was making a scene, and I said, very gently, that the scene had been made years ago and I was only turning on the light. I could have stayed to supervise the fallout and savor the spectacle of respectable people running drills in crisis communication, but revenge, when done correctly, is not a residency, it is a house call. So I thanked the MC for the microphone and I turned to the room and said that in honor of my parents' long devotion to family I had arranged, through the Hospice Foundation, a scholarship in my son's name for parents who land in that cruel space between a denial letter and a yes that arrives 1 week too late, and I added that the first donation had already cleared, courtesy of the Benevolence Committee's discretionary fund, which had been inspired by an anonymous documentation of unmet need. And the committee chair blinked once with the mortified dignity of a person who realizes he has been working for the truth while believing he was defending appearances, and a few people even clapped before they remembered clapping could be read as taking sides. I placed a small stack of blank thank you cards by the folder and said, with a smile so polite it almost felt kind, that anyone who wished to honor my parents' legacy could write something real on paper that day. And I would see that it reached the foundation with names spelled correctly and amounts counted honestly, because if we are going to talk about family investment, we might as well earn some interest. I did not look back as I walked out, because mythology belongs to the people who need to narrate your posture for their own comfort, and outside, the summer air pressed against my face like a heavy book that had finally been closed. And I sat in the car without turning the key and let the quiet rise until it reached the level where thoughts swim, and I considered calling my mother later to say that love can survive reckoning if it wants to, and I considered never calling again because some gardens grow better without the old vines choking the fence, and I did neither. I just watched the door and waited for no one, which felt like a decision even if it was only a pause. Somewhere in that hall, menus were being folded and reputations were learning to breathe through smaller noses, and somewhere, in a mailbox I would not check until morning, donations and condemnations would sit together like siblings who share a bedroom. And I let myself imagine only for a second that my son, who liked the planet with rings because it looked like it understood boundaries, would have approved of an orbit that kept me at a safe distance, while everything that needed to collide finally met itself. Whether I would forgive them tomorrow or next year or never at all was not the riddle I needed to solve that night. The only answer that mattered was the one the room had already given me, which was silence thick enough to carry weight, and as for closure, I did not hunt it. I rolled down the window and let the dark come in, and I told the part of me that still wanted a parent to say the right words that sometimes the closest thing to comfort is choosing where the story ends, even if you leave a few lights on in the house behind you.